Shalom and welcome everybody. The State Zionist Council is putting on this talk with Ron Weiser tonight, an update about Israel. And on the 25th of August at 8 p.m, we have our next online event, which will be with Ami Horowitz from New York, and it'll be entitled The New Anti-Semitism. It'll be fascinating, so I hope you can also join for that. And Tennille is going to, in the chat, put in the registration link so that you can register for that Ami Horowitz talk. But for now, we are really excited to be hosting Ron Weiser, who is Dr. Ron Weiser, AM, a member of the Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency, the Sochnut, and a past president of both the Zionist Council of New South Wales and the Zionist Federation of Australia. Ron has received numerous rewards in his 50 years of communal service, including the Herzl Award from the World Zionist Organization, the Jerusalem Prize, which was presented to him by Rabbi Meir Lau, and his AM, which was awarded in 2010. He's a well-known observer of Israeli politics and a regular opinion writer. His monthly Israel opinion writing can be seen on the Zionist Federation of Australia email that comes out once a week, but Ron's opinion piece comes out once a month. And over to you, Ron. Oh, just a caretaking point. If you have any questions during the talk, feel free to type them in the chat. And the last part of our session together will be a Q&A. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you, Orna, and thanks for having me. As usual, I'm going to do a PowerPoint, which I'll share with you shortly. And then after that, happy to have some Q&A. I just want to remind everybody that what we're looking at tonight is the new government, and it's now lasted for 8 weeks. And you should be starting to see that coming up on your screens. And they said it couldn't last, but it's lasted 8 weeks, which is a short time, I guess, but which feels like a very long time. And what we're going to discuss tonight are really the challenges that this new government faces on a daily basis. But everybody knows that in any of the presentations I've given, I always raise some version of this slide first because we can't lose sight of what it is that we're attempting to do. So the question always is, what is Zionism? And very simply, it's about Jews securing and determining the fate of the Jewish people. And we have to remember the Jewish state is the vehicle for that task. It's not the end result. It's the vehicle for that task. And the question always is how do we make her fit for purpose? So we need to recap that 8 weeks ago, the government came in based on these election results in March. I'm not going to go into too much detail of them, but as you all know, there's 8 parties in government, and they're all the ones in red. Obviously, the biggest party is led by Yair Lapid. And what's interesting to note is that of the 8, 7 of them are generally quite liberal and progressive when it comes to internal issues in Israel. And of course, the one that isn't is the one that the Israeli Arab Party called Ram, led by Mansour Abbas, who is a dentist. And of course, that is a fundamentalist conservative party, mainly elected by Bedouins from the south of Israel. And also, generally speaking, when it comes to the external issues, more parties are to the centre right or right than to the left or centre left within this government. So it makes sounds like there can be more consensus from time to time than really people tend to think there is. But 4 people dominate this Knesset. And the first one that dominates this Knesset is, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, because even though he's in the opposition, he's really the glue holding the government coalition together. because what unites the 8 parties more than anything else is their determination that Bibi Netanyahu should not be the prime minister. So as long as he is the head of the Likud, that coalition has its main unifying glue. Of course, were the Likud to change its leadership, all bets might be off. Now, his priority is to try and deny the governing coalition any success in any piece of legislation. And that's regardless of what the legislation is, and even whether the Likud do agree with the legislation or not. So although you don't hear him that often, his shadow hangs over this entire Knesset. Now, for instance, in normal Western democracies, you have something called pairing. Remember, this government won its confidence motion by 60 to 59. So if a member is away, if a member has to conduct meetings, if a member of the Knesset is overseas, usually in normal convention, a member of the other party will also not vote in things so as to keep at least the spirit of what the election was. Well, pairing has been stopped here. It reminds me of the time in Australia when Gough Whitlam was the Prime Minister and the Liberals denied a pairing with Labor. But what you have is a ridiculous situation where you have quite often, and here's just one example, people coming out of hospital have to come to the Knesset to vote. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to pass any piece of legislation. And this is a particularly interesting piece of legislation that happened on the 27th of July, because it was the amendment to the basic law that guaranteed that there will be a rotation between Bennett and Lapid. Now, as I said, Weiser, it's just one example. Many have come out of hospital to vote. But the final reading of the bill passed by a vote of 61 to 2, because when Netanyahu saw that the Bennett-Lapid coalition was going to win that vote, they just left the Knesset and didn't even bother to vote. So they were not willing to pair. They were forcing Weiser to come out of hospital in order to pass this legislation. But then it passed very easily because they didn't even bother. They left the Knesset. But it's also interesting to note that similar legislation, when Netanyahu proposed it for the supposed rotation between him and Gantz, it was then opposed by Lapid, but now Bennett and Lapid decided that it was fair enough legislation. But the pairing is just an interesting thing to make you aware of just how difficult it is to run business in this Knesset. So, of course, we've discussed Bibi Netanyahu. So the two main people who dominate this government are, of course, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and Foreign Minister, and later become Prime Minister, alternative Prime Minister Yair Lapid. And it's very important to remember that it's Lapid who made this deal happen. And all of the 7 other parties have coalition agreements with Lapid. They don't have them with Bennett. So the 7 parties have their coalition agreements with Yair Lapid. The only party that Bennett actually has a coalition agreement with is also with Lapid. And in theory, this deal or the agreement between Bennett and Lapid supersedes or overrides all of the other coalition agreements. But as we'll see, only to a point. And of course, the 4th person to dominate this Knesset is Mansour Abbas from the Ram Party. And as I've said previously, I, Mansour Abbas, a man of the Islamic movement, I'm a proud Arab Muslim, a citizen of the State of Israel. He's made the decision to be part and parcel of the State of Israel and to push for his aims. The 3 main aims he has is to deal with Israeli-Arab organized crime, Israeli-Arab mafia, basically, and some 55 or so Israeli Arabs have been killed so far this year by fighting between Israeli-Arab crime units, to improve Israeli-Arab infrastructure, and to recognize 3 unauthorized Bedouin towns in the south. Now, the biggest achievement of this government to date, in my view, is the budget. Not that the budget is finalized as yet, but the budget, there hasn't been a budget in Israel now for 3 years. And the passing of a budget is extremely difficult. But the budget proposed by this new government is probably the most ambitious budget reform agenda in recent memory. And it's a major policy document. And it will transform and set the tone for the next period of time in the State of Israel. And you should be aware at least of some of them. There's so many, it's such a big agenda that I'm only going to highlight a few. One, for instance, is the changes in kashrut. Now, that may sound like a small change, and what does it have to do with the budget? But it's got huge implications for the chief rabbinate. And just on the side, Israel's gold medal winner in Tokyo, the prime minister rings him up and congratulates him, and he's, celebrated by the whole country. And turns out, halakhically, he's not Jewish. His father's Jewish, his mother isn't. And as his mother points out, the whole of Israel is celebrating him, but yet he can't marry his girlfriend in Israel because there's no civil marriage. And the importance of the kashrut changes are that it may be the beginning of the breaking of the monopoly of the chief rabbinate, and it's an important step within the budget by this government. Of course, dealing with the Haredi stipends, so that Haredim who don't work and don't go to the army will have their stipends cut. But there's so many cost of living reforms, agriculture reforms, ending agricultural monopolies, lowering the cost of staple products, making importing easier by reforming the Standards Authority. Previously, even if standards were accepted by the EU or the United States, Israel had its own complex system which made it hard to bring stuff into the country, all aimed at lowering, as I said, the cost of living. Raising women's retirement age from 62 to 65. A housing plan to convert tens of millions of square metres of unused office space into residences to create new housing options. A plan to tax disposable plasticware and utensils. Taxes on sugary drinks. Massive transportation infrastructure projects, and they're really massive. Plans to build Israel's medical cannabis industry, and many, many more ambitious things within this budget. Now, another interesting thing is that the budget also deals with Israel's minorities. So included in this budget is 12.4 billion Australian dollars intended for Israel's minorities, and it's approximately double the previous budget allocations for the same things. Remember Mansour Abbas and his conditions for joining the government, and here is where the payoff is coming. Additionally, it was agreed that just over $1 billion will be directed at fighting crime and violence in the Arab sector. And this has led to comments like this by Israeli Arab professor Dr. Salim Break, for instance, that this plan is unprecedented. And if it is indeed realised, it will make a difference to the Arab population. And at the end of the day, I also think it will contribute to the state, says Dr. Break. The Deputy Public Security Minister says he's in a rush. We're not going to wait a long time. He says, I believe that in 2 months, people will start to feel that things have changed. That's the time span I'm imagining. And of course, we're talking about from the passing of the budget itself. And Prime Minister Naftali Bennett says that the violence and crime in Arab Israeli communities is a national calamity. So you can see the amazing broad scope of this budget and also the impact of Mansour Abbas within this construct. And of course, the finance minister is Avigdor Lieberman, a tough, no-nonsense person who, should this budget pass, he will certainly have his reputation enhanced. The first step is that this budget was approved by the cabinet last Monday. And that's a really important step, because with all of the competing interests and all of the ability of even one member of the Knesset to bring this undone, one member of the government, it's an amazing step that this government has been able to get all, at least the leadership of the parties, to pass it through the cabinet. Now, it needs to be passed by the Knesset by the 4th of November. A lot can happen between now and then. And of course, it not only now involves keeping the leadership of each party in line, but now all of the members of the party in line. And that's a very difficult job, and there'll be a lot of lobbying by interests to try and get them to change that. But that's a key date, because if the budget doesn't pass by the 4th of November, the government falls and we're going to another election. And Chaviv Reti Gur, who's an excellent observer of what's going on, says something that people have been actually noting. At the government swearing in, pundits suggested that hovering permanently at the edge of a political precipice would make the new ministers timid and the government unassertive. But if anything, life on the edge have had the opposite effect. This government is going quickly for broke. And I think that it's important to appreciate that the budget is transformative. It's probably, we haven't seen a budget like this probably for about 20 years. Now, I want to do 3 case studies just to show the difficulties and from the political point of view that the government has to contend with. So the first case study, or the first part of it, is Khan al-Akhbar, which is the Supreme Court of Israel has repeatedly instructed the state to dismantle. It's an illegal Bedouin encampment. and it's home to about 70 families. Now, here's what the Supreme Court Justice wrote 2 years later, 2 years after the decision. There's nothing new under the sun. This court, in carrying out its decisions, nothing has changed. The government must honour its own pronouncements and enable these pronouncements seriously and not render them null or vacant. So what happens is the government goes to the Supreme Court, says, please, can we, dismantle this illegal Bedouin encampment? The government says yes. The High Court says yes. And then the government doesn't do anything. And who do you think this was written to? This was written to Bibi Netanyahu. This is an old case. This was back in November 2020. But now this government has to deal with it. And even though Netanyahu never did dismantle this illegal settlement, he's going to be now hitting this government to say that they should. But of course, here comes Yair Lapid, and he's pushing the coalition government to delay the demolition of this illegal Bedouin town built on state land. Lapid wants to delay it, arguing that the town's demolition should be called off until the security and foreign policy implications can be assessed. Although they're legal questions, at the end of the day, political decisions. And the flip side of this is a good case study for the second half is of Sheikh Jarrah, which again, you all know the story of. The lower Israeli courts have approved the eviction. The Supreme Court was now considering it. And the Supreme Court comes up on Monday with a proposed compromise. It's not a legal decision, which the courts normally make. It's a compromise that they're recommending to the government, and that is that the Palestinians stay on as protected tenants, pay 630 Australian dollars approximately a year in fees, peppercorn rentals to the owners. The Palestinians could then choose who they want to be protected tenants, which would mean that the evictions can be delayed for decades. And in exchange, the Palestinians don't even have to recognise that it's Jewishly owned, only that Nachalat Shimon is registered as a properties owner in Israel. Now, this is a decision that the new government is going to have to make with all of the difficulties within it. It's a compromise that the Palestinians don't want. It's a compromise that the Jewish owners don't want. And yet it's a compromise that was proposed by the state. So again, these are, in a political sense, these two cases, some of the challenges that the government is in the middle of facing. And I want to go to case study number 2, which is what happened a couple of weeks ago on Tisha B'Av. Now, on Tisha B'Av, it's customary, as in other times, of course, but for Jews to go up onto the Temple Mount, onto Har HaBayit, and the status quo agreement, whether you like it or not, that Israel, Jordan, and the Islamic Waqf made, is that Jews can go on Temple Mount but are not allowed to pray there. Muslims, however, can. So let's not argue about the actual agreement, but that is the agreement. And what happens, generally speaking, is, as happened this Tisha B'Av, for instance, about 1,800 Jews went up there, 1,800 approximately. They didn't pray loudly. Some prayed silently, some very quietly. It wasn't a big fuss was made out of it until Prime Minister Bennett, trying to assert himself as, Jewish rights to the area, issued a tweet hailing the maintaining of Jewish worship at the site. Now, remember we said before that it's a tussle between who has the leadership, Bennett, Lapid, who really controls what's going on. Now, immediately after this tweet comes out from Prime Minister Bennett, Lapid speaks with Bennett and then tells journalists that there was, in fact, no change to the status quo. In other words, that nothing has changed to the original status quo. Moreover, Lapid then speaks with the Jordanians, and now over time, the Jordanians, particularly the king, had expressed great concern about the deterioration of the relationship with Israel, particularly with Netanyahu, who he didn't get on with, didn't want to meet. And Bennett and Lapid have spent a lot of political capital to try and rebuild that relationship, which was accepted by the king. We'll see a bit more of that later on. But he explains to the king that no change has taken place on Temple Mount. And then Bennett's office issues a clarification stating that he had meant to say freedom of visits to Jews and not freedom of worship. So it's a big backtrack by Bennett in this case. And then, so you've got these two people in the government with very differing views on this. And then, of course, Mansour Abbas comes along. He's a part of the government as well. He issues his own statement where he says, Al-Aqsa Mosque is the pure right of Muslims and others have no right to it. So, are all these just declarative statements? Are they forming part of policy? But these are three very different views within the one government. Now, we all know about the Ben and Jerry and the BDS. A member of Lapid's party got a letter demanding Unilever scrap Ben and Jerry's boycott. 90 MKs signed it. They were from across the political spectrum. And then 6 of the MKs walked it back and said they were not part of it, but that still left 84 MKs that signed it. Now, just to show you what's going to happen with the budget and everything else that comes along in a 60 to 59 majority government, I'm going to just concentrate in my case 3 on one particular member of the Knesset. Now, this is Yair Golan. He is a member of Meretz. He's currently the Deputy Minister of Economy and Industry. He's a previous Deputy Chief of Staff of the IDF, and it's complicated. He's a thinking person whose views change over time, or as he thinks about them, but all the time with some sort of a reason. Now, he's the only member of Meretz that signed that letter, and then he's one who walked it back. So he objected to the description of West Bank settlements as towns and cities in Israel. That was his objection. So he asked his signature to be removed. He was opposed to the Ben and Jerry boycott, but he didn't like that wording in the letter. And I remind you that on Yom HaShoah in 2016, he made really a rather shocking statement where he said, Dafka on Yom HaShoah, the horrific processes which developed in Europe and led to the Nazi genocide were present in Israel today. And then he walked that sentence back later on. But now we come to this month. Now, the word occupation is actually part of Meretz's platform. Meretz is the most left-wing party, Jewish party, inside the current government. And as I said, Yair Golan is a member of the Meretz party, but he's objecting now to the word occupation because he says it has the connotation of a callous act, as if we took a piece of land that we have nothing to do with. So ultimately, he says, our roots are in the territory of Judea and Samaria. He even dreams of the land of the Bible. I tell my friends on my right, my connection to every clump of the land of Israel is no less than yours. It would be a terrible decree to evacuate many settlers from their homes. He doesn't say most settlers, some settlers, or all the settlers. But here's an example of a person who's been very high in the Israeli establishment, is currently a deputy minister, is part of the government. And if you can discern any clear trend in this, well, then you'll see just how difficult it is with this government to keep all of its 60 members in line. Now, of course, externally, which concerns people perhaps even more, the big red danger is, of course, Iran. And of immediate concern is what's going on in Lebanon and Gaza. Now, we're not going to discuss, at least in this presentation, with things we're sticking to the political aspects, too much about what's going on. You've all been reading about that and seeing it on your screens. But the important thing to understand here is that Bennett and Lapid took a decision to respond more strongly than Netanyahu, who was more proportionate in a certain way. So, for instance, what that means is when the incendiary balloons came over from Gaza, Netanyahu used to respond with artillery fire. What happened when it came over now from Lebanon and Hezbollah got involved? Artillery fire would have normally been met, although we haven't seen it for a long time, by Netanyahu with artillery fire. But in both cases, this government responded with airstrikes included in their response. And the question is, which is the way that's going to, number one, ensure the safety of the citizens of the state of Israel, and number two, show the other side or warn them in effect that Israel's deterrence ability is still there. So will we get an escalation or not? But remember, they're all proxies of Iran. What's going on in Syria and Russia, Jordan will come to a little bit later. And of course, the shadow war that's taking place with shipping. Now, in keeping with the Yair Lapid and Bennett's policy of trying to win more international support, instead of responding immediately to issues with shipping and the attacks on shipping, they're trying to build support from the EU and the United States and Britain and demonstrate that Iran is behind all of these things. But there's no question that the external question is Iran. On Iran, the government is united. It's not a divisive matter within the coalition. and it's far easier for them to take united action. Of course, there will be a difference on tactics, but it's not an ideological issue. Which brings us to the Abraham Accords, which are directly linked to Iran. Now, King Abdullah did a very interesting interview on CNN at the end of July when he was asked which country he believes will be the next to normalize relations with Israel following the Abraham Accords, which led to ties, etc. So even if you see from the question, it's not even, I mean, it's a given that other countries want to join. But Abdullah, who praises both Bennett and Lapid now, gave a very interesting response. He said, I don't know which country is going to be the next, but I've noticed that a trend from Arab countries that are looking at their national security interests with their concerns, the shadow of Iran, along with a lot of the regional challenges that see the option of having a relationship with Israel in their vested interest. So here's King Abdullah of Jordan, one of the 6 countries with a peace treaty with Israel, or some form of arrangement with Israel, in no doubt that the other Arab countries, in terms of looking at their national interests and wondering about what's going on with Iran, are looking at least the option of having a relationship with Israel. And he's come out so publicly on that, and I think that's a win for Bennett and Lapid. But the big question, of course, is President Biden. Now, in earlier talks, I praised him when it came to the war with Gaza, but on Iran, we're not yet sure where we're going with it. And in contrast to the Trump administration's tough stance on Iran, is President Biden's willingness to negotiate with and reach an as yet unknown agreement with Iran undermining the strategic rationale for normalization agreements between Israel and the Gulf states? So if you go back to King Abdullah's rationale, it's the Iran bogey that's bringing other Arab countries to consider this. Would they be less or more likely to consider joining with Israel if President Biden seems to be softening towards Iran or makes some agreement with Iran that maybe is not advantageous as Israel would see it? So we don't know, but that's the big question, is what's President Biden going to do, and will his actions improve Israel's situation or make it actually more difficult for other Arab countries to join? And the question, of course, again, is how do Bennett and Lapid handle this? Now, Netanyahu was lucky in the last 4 years of his prime ministership because he had a great relationship with Trump. It was a Republican administration. But as you all know, we lost the bipartisan support in the United States. And Bennett and Lapid, as I mentioned before, are doing everything possible, but quietly and without trying to embarrass the United States president, at least up until this point in time. And that goes back to some of the other case studies, the Sheikh Jarrah and the Bedouin town and all of those sorts of things, trying to keep the Americans on side, trying to make Israel look as reasonable as it can, and trying to make sure that the Americans either become tougher with Iran or make sure that any deal that it makes with Iran is a much better deal than the one Obama made. So I'll finish off with this slide and then we can go to some discussion. So what is the future of this government? Well, it can break apart at any time. And I've tried to show you the sort of tentative nature of it. But by the same token, it can last for some time. A lot will depend on what happens in the Likud, but it's got an agenda and it's going for it. And it's getting great kudos for that. What to do about Iran and her proxies, that, of course, can make or break this government, just as assessments about the JCPOA deal, if it comes ahead. And, of course, the big shadow, which is creeping up on Israel, not even creeping, but rather escalating, is what's to do about COVID as the cases increase and as the health system comes under more pressure. Now, it's interesting because, you know, Bibi Netanyahu, when he was not the prime minister, wrote a book on how to deal with terrorism. And basically, in a nutshell, his number one principle was you don't exchange hostages for terrorists. And, you know, that's a no-no. Of course, what happened was when he became the prime minister, he made the biggest prisoner exchange in the history of the state of Israel in return for Gilad Shalit. So the irony of that is that Bennett was a big critic of Netanyahu's policy of lockdowns and other things. And he wrote a book too. And that book is just published now. And now the question is he going to follow what he wrote in that book, or is he going to follow let's say, the health advice that happens in Israel, and then maybe have to go into another lockdown with the concurrent economic damage. He's at least, if he's going to go into lockdown, trying to delay it till next month during the Chagim because of two reasons. One is because in the Chagim, a lot more gatherings take place, but the other is it will cause less economic damage during the Chagim because in any case, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, so many days of the month, businesses are either closed or on holidays or whatever. And of course, the budget. The budget still sits behind everything. It's not passed. The cabinet has passed it. We have till the 4th of November. Any, again, individual member of the government could come up with some sort of additional demands or whatever. Can the leaders of each party keep their people in line? From time to time they can. Bennett can't keep all of his people in line. Mansour Abbas can't keep all of his people in line. Lapid seems to be able to keep his people in line. But will Meretz balk at one or two of the things? I mean, it's still a big open question. And then, of course, the very last thing is that anything can happen. There might be items that come forward that we can't predict. So what we can say is, I think with quite a degree of confidence, that this government has done very well for the first 8 weeks. It's done well with the challenges it's faced. It's managed to overcome its own internal differences, and we're only talking about 8 weeks. But if the budget is any indication of its ability to work together and its ability to solve problems out of the headlines, well, that might augur well for its future. So I think at that point, Ami, I'll leave my presentation and hand back to you.
Thank you, Ron. That's, certainly very comprehensive, given sort of, whilst it's only been 8 weeks, there's a lot that has been happening. So we're starting to get some questions coming in already. The first one is, why or how does the kashrut appear in the budget?
So kashrut appears in the budget very simply because it's a monopoly situation of the chief rabbinate. And as part of the general measures to end cost of living pressures is to end some of the monopolies. So it's by ending the monopoly of the chief rabbinate over the control of kashrut, and therefore allowing other authorities to come forward and be recognized as supervising authorities, such as the modern Orthodox rabbinate, the Rabbinate Sohar, and people like that.
The next one is, now that the Arab politicians have got their hechsher to join the government, and primarily was initially by the Bibi sort of inviting Ram to join their party, do you think that moving forward it will strengthen the centre-left alliance and allow them to include the 10 to 15 Arab members in government on a go-forward basis?
Certainly the Rubicon has been crossed, right? This is a watershed moment to actually have formally an Israeli Arab party as part of the government. The irony shouldn't be lost on anybody, as you said in the question, that it was Bibi Netanyahu who opened this pathway. And interestingly enough, traditionally, Israeli Arab parties have tended to prefer negotiations with, associations with the right rather than the left, because they understood them better, they tended to be more conservative, and so on and so forth. Now, people like Bezalel Smotrich in the opposition warn precisely what the questioner has said, and that is that by having them in now, the centre-left can always join with them and almost have an automatic majority. But at the end of the day, I don't think that that's really the case. We've seen that Mansour Abbas, for instance, has made virtually no ideological demands, at least at this point in time. People ask more whether he's sincere. A lot will depend on what happens, whether he can show his people that he got achievements out of doing this, or whether you can never do a deal with basically Zionist parties. So we'll see. And the other important thing to remember is that there's no such thing anymore in Israel as the right wing and the left wing. You can be right on one issue and left on another issue. So it's more an issues-based situation. And you can see that, these 8 parties that are together now, in theory, if you looked at the party policy platforms, they can't go together. But each party ignores its own policy platform. Since the year 2000, there's more or less a natural majority for the right. And if Likud was not led by Bibi Netanyahu today, it would probably be in power. The right still has a national majority, but of course, for the right, it is a certain danger. But only time will tell. A lot will depend on what happens in this experiment now. But this is a watershed moment.
Next question is, does the new government strengthen the solidarity of the diaspora communities with Israel?
So there's no question that this government is much more focused on relationships with the general diaspora. Now, the problem in the United States, which is the largest diaspora community, is that largely 70 to 80%, probably something like 75% of American Jews vote Democrat. They split according to party lines. If they didn't like Trump, they didn't like Bibi. Netanyahu had, because of the makeup of his coalition and his reliance upon the Haredim, had gone back on the Kotel Compromise and on the recognition of the progressive and conservative streams in the United States or around the world. There's no doubt that large sections of United States Jewry and diaspora Jew were alienated, whether correctly or not, but they were. This government, Nachman Shai is the Diaspora Affairs Minister. He's already put it on the agenda to have the Western Wall compromise. I mean, Naftali Bennett, in his agreement with Lapid, which overrides all the other agreements, says there won't be any change, excuse me, in the religious status quo. But as we already demonstrated by the Kashrut example, that's not true. So the question is, how far will Bennett be willing to go to allow Lapid and the rest of the coalition, which are united on this, really, to have a greater recognition of the streams. What's for certain is, and it's in the budget, is there's going to be more money for progressive and conservative streams in the United States, in the Diaspora Affairs Ministry. Going in parallel with the new president of the State of Israel, Buzzi Herzog, who the Americans really like, and who was the head of the Sochnut in his previous job, was already going in very far in that direction. I think that at this point in time, we should assume that this government is going to rebuild a lot of the bridges with diaspora Jewry.
Next one is dealing with also international relations. So Caroline Glick argues that placating Biden, Bennett and Lapid have changed their relationship with Putin, who had a strong relationship with Netanyahu, primarily as a result of Bibi having stood up to Obama. Do we think that Putin's decision to stop Israeli incursions into Syria has any validity towards that argument?
Look, she may be right. I can't tell you. We don't know. Only time will tell. What we do know is that Netanyahu had a very good relationship with Putin and a very good relationship with Trump. And there were certain positives out of that. There are people in Israel who say that there were many negatives out of that relationship as well. So it's something that we'll only know with time. But definitely it's more complicated for Israel in Syria because of the change in Russian tactics. I don't think Israel ceased activities in Syria entirely, but it has made it more difficult. And look, a lot relies on how Biden will proceed. So it's too early to say whether that's right or wrong. But Caroline Glick, if you're from the right, like Caroline Glick, from I would even say the very right, I don't want to say extreme right, then you're not going to trust anything that Biden does at all. All I can say is that in Israel, Biden is regarded as a friend of Israel. He does have also his own political problems. He has to look over his shoulder at the squad and the extreme left of the Democrats. But so far, he's increased military support for Israel. He's increased financial support for Israel. He made a lot of commitments after the war with Hamas. He's got a policy of not supporting Hamas and trying to bolster the Palestinian Authority, which is in line with Israel's policy. So I think we'll just have to wait and see. But it's a very difficult question for Lapid and Bennett. But as I said earlier, their method of dealing with this is to try, at least at this point in time, not to embarrass Biden, not to publicly out him as such, but to work behind the scenes and in a cooperative way.
The next questioner is actually thanking you, like the rest of us, for a very good and very informative session. They referred to the fact the budget you described seems extremely progressive on virtually all fronts. Is that a good thing?
Well, I did point out when I was talking about the members of the parties that they are all liberal and progressive. I mean, the parties that make up this coalition, with the exception of RAM, of the Israeli Arab Party, which is conservative, fundamentalist, chauvinistic, etc. Is it a good thing? Well, we'll see. But it's indicative of the fact. I personally do think it's a good thing. I mean, if it works, if you can reduce the cost of living, if you can give people more individual freedoms, if you can do all of those sorts of things, that's a very positive thing. But I think just as impressive out of the budget is, as I said before, is that the cabinet passed it. That 8 different parties with so many different views were able. I mean, there must have been disagreements about, different. We know the famous one is the health ministry that was asked for more money and got it. But it's not easy to form a budget, especially when it hasn't been one for 3 years. And I think the fact that they formed the budget and the fact that this government wants to be seen to be doing something and not just, sitting there till Netanyahu departs, I think that is a very positive thing. And I haven't been able to find for myself anything that I've seen in the budget, and I said it's extremely ambitious, that hasn't appealed to me. So, I think it's very positive.
Who's making the military decisions, Gantz, or is it Lapid and Bennett? And Gantz and Lebanon, how much influence does Gantz wield in the government?
So I didn't mention him as one of the 4 key people, but if I was to mention 5 key people, he would have been my 5th. He's very influential. Don't forget, he's also an ex-chief of staff. Forget whether he's respected politically because he was taken in by Netanyahu or not. He is respected militarily. And he plays a very big role, particularly in relations with the United States. And you will find Gantz is actually more to the right on many defense and military issues. We don't know yet who really is the key influence, but Bennett is to the right on military issues, but Gantz is, I would say, at least as right as Bennett, but appears not to be so right. So therefore, when he says it, it's more acceptable to a broader range of people. And I think that kudos to Bennett for one very important thing and that is he doesn't see the need to be the lead person on every single decision. But I think if we're going to talk about security and military issues, Gantz is a huge player. And I think the questioner is entirely correct, at least to mention those 3, Lapid, Bennett, and Gantz.
Next one, is there a chance that the Lapid-Bennett coalition get larger rather than breaking up? For example, religious parties joining or secure a better deal for their voters?
So that's their dream. Their dream is to get larger. In fact, some members of the coalition want to get larger so that they won't have to rely on Mansour Abbas and his support when it comes to maybe issues that Mansour Abbas will have problems with, for instance, like the Temple Mount. They are trying to get people to break off from the Likud. They are trying to get other people from the opposition, just as the Likud in opposition is trying to get people to break away from the current coalition. In terms of the Haredi parties, it would be very difficult now, I think, for the Haredi parties. I mean, Finance Minister Lieberman is the most anti-Haredi person in cabinet. He's the finance minister, as I've said, and he's put really harsh, harsh facts to the Haredi representatives, and he's in no mood to make a compromise. So in order for the Haredim to come in, they would have to win something, and the wins that they would want would anger at least half the coalition. who have taken a very strong, stance on Haredim, not just the chief rabbinate, but serving in the army, the stipends, the certainly financial cost to people. So it's hard to see the Haredim joining, but in Israel, you never say never. And the louder one says no, it could be closer to the yes, but it's easier to see some members of the Likud jumping to this coalition than it is for me to see Haredim jumping. But anyway, it's something again that's in the realm of the theoretical. But this government would like desperately to have a few more members. Yes.
No doubt. Next one is, does the Israeli summer holidays of July, August help the government survive? And is there a possibility that once the high holidays are over, there will be a more effective opposition?
I don't think so, because as I mentioned about the pairing and so on and so forth, whenever the Knesset's sitting, right, that's the time. So the only time that the opposition will be more effective, in my view, is if some of the policies of this government start to fail. And they were some of the question marks that I raised in my last slide, particularly to do with Iran and COVID. I think that those two issues will either assist the opposition or assist the government. Because when people start to evaluate the handling of those issues, that affects them directly. Iran's proxies, I mean, if Israel ends up having to go to war with Hezbollah, those issues can change dramatically. But I don't think that the holiday season, the summer holiday season in Israel itself makes a big difference at all.
Thank you. How damaging is the disgraceful behaviour by the ultra-Orthodox in the Knesset? Does it divide society even more?
I think people understand that if the Haredim are complaining, why they're complaining. Only one previous Prime Minister was happy to leave Haredim out of government. That was Ariel Sharon. And he formed a huge government, I think something between 70 and 80 members of the Knesset without them. And the Haredim learned a powerful lesson that you can't do anything from opposition for your sectoral interests. So they're not appealing to any other sector for their votes. I don't think that how they behave affects their votes, and I don't think it divides society more, because people have quite fixed views on how they see them, and people know that they're hurting. So when people are hurt, they do react more strongly.
Calling the Prime Minister a murderer?
Well, the Haredim are the Haredim, so they're after their sectional interests. I mean, a member of the government, as an example, I gave Yair Golan, saying Israel's got elements of the Nazi state. I mean, right. Rhetoric in Israel is at a higher level than it is here. I often tell the story that, my wife, whose background is Iraqi, when I first met my in-laws, they said how wonderful I was. And I thought, wow, they really like me. And then I realized that's how they speak. Everybody's wonderful, and it's like, it's just a higher level of emotion. But yes, look, they say some shocking things, but it's not exclusively what they say. Each political party has people within it who are the attack dogs, if you like.
Next one is, why do you think the Israeli ambassador to the UN and the US is the same person? Has it ever been done before?
So it's not the same person. It was an interim arrangement. Erdogan is the UN ambassador, and now the USA ambassador is actually Michael Herzog. He's the brother of Bougie Herzog, the president of the State of Israel. It was just an interim measure. I don't know if it's ever been done before. I can't tell you. But it was never meant to be a permanent arrangement, and it's not. So now there are two separate ambassadors. What we'd like to know is who is the ambassador to Australia. But that's a different story.
Correct. What is Turkey doing? Is it shifting to counter Iran, or do you think that, or do you not believe the shift is in its rhetoric?
What is who doing?
Turkey.
Oh, Turkey. Look, we have to remember that the Muslim world is divided in two ways, between Shiites and Sunnis, but also between Arab and non-Arab. Now, the Arab and non-Arab is a geographical division. Both Turkey and Iran are non-Arab. And both are trying to get leadership of the entire area. Of course, the Ottoman Empire ruled, Israel, the area Israel was in for nearly 400 years. So Turkey at one time had tremendously close relations with Israel. And of course, that's deteriorated dramatically. But Turkey wants to be a player. And Turkey is been pushed aside, if you like, by the events with Iran, by the leadership of Egypt in the war with Gaza, in the Israeli war with Gaza, the 11-day war that took place not so long ago. I don't know. Erdogan is a problem. By the way, Trump allowed Erdogan a latitude of freedom of action. Biden is tougher on Turkey. Maybe Turkey is making new noises because they want to cozy up to Biden. I don't know, but they're not a central player at this very point in time.
Getting pretty close to the end. So this one is for me. Ron, if we started off talking about the government. If you were to take bets, what do you think the odds are of a rotation actually happening?
Well, when the rotation was supposed to take place between Netanyahu and Gantz, then I was very confident that the rotation would not take place. And I said that I don't even think Gantz believed it would take place. And he was part of the agreement. Look, if this government survives, the rotation will take place. The big question is, will this government survive? Now, Bennett has an interest for this government to survive because he's pretty much lost his constituency. Came in with 7 seats, lost one of them along the way, or he's got a rebel within his own ranks. But it's pretty much understood that if there was an election today, he'd get even less seats, maybe not cross the threshold. So he has a personal interest for this government to go as long as possible because he needs to demonstrate that he really is a prime minister and somebody that can, fit that position. So it's in his personal interest that the government goes on for as long as possible so he can rebuild his base. Lapid, I think Lapid, in coming to this government and forming this government and letting or offering Bennett to go first, everybody understands that it was quite a degree of self-sacrifice on his part. He put, he didn't seek the front position at all costs. He's coming out of this very well. He's got nothing to lose by staying as the foreign minister and alternative prime minister for the next 2 years. So, really the question is, can the government survive? And I think that depends on whether the 8 leaders of the parties can hold their factions together. Lapid's faction is more likely to stay together than maybe Bennett's, for example. Ayelet Shaked is not comfortable in this government, and she's very popular with the Likud. It's, she could be, if she was offered the leadership of the Likud to swap, you never know what could happen. But I'm not a betting man, but I'm more confident that this rotation will take place than I was about the Gantz-Netanyahu rotation. But seeing as I had zero confidence in that, I wouldn't overrate that. I think it's a month-by-month proposition, and we'll have a lot more information or idea about that if this government really hits its straps. It's made a lot of promises. As I say, the budget is not yet a fact, but if the budget actually gets through, if temperature cools with Hezbollah, if COVID doesn't turn out to be a disaster that's sheeted home at this government. Netanyahu dealt with COVID shockingly, over 6,000 deaths, but he dealt with the vaccination tremendously. It shows that you can have a bad period if you can resolve it. The opinion polls, if you believe them, are showing that the public have much more confidence in Netanyahu dealing with COVID than Bennett dealing with COVID at the moment. But that can change. So I would say that it's too early to tell if rotation will take place, but there's a better chance of Lapid becoming prime minister than Gantz had.
There's one more question here, and then I'll ask a final question. What are the new infrastructure proposals in the budget?
They're huge. You have to go and read them. You can look them up on the internet, but they're to do with transport. They're to do with housing. They're to do with infrastructure. I mean, oh, you said what are the infrastructure proposals? But you know, it's the list is enormous, and the fact that they've managed to put in the budget money to it, I don't know how reliable the amounts are, whether they turn out to be, you know, undervaluations or something. But mainly around transport and infrastructure spending for housing. They would be the two that I would nominate. By the way, aside from that, there's also increased budget for the army. There's increased budget for the health system. You can ask, where is all this money coming from? But you can ask the same question in the Australian scene. All of a sudden, debt is not such a bad thing, and interest rates are low. I don't know for how long they'll stay low, but stimulus measures are looked upon favourably. Look, congestion on the Tel Aviv highway every morning is a nightmare, these are the areas of the proposals.
So, Ron, last question for me. This is a game, a bit of a probability, one of Bibi sort of, leading Likud to the next election, whenever that election is going to be.
I think that the chances of Bibi leading the Likud to the next election, should the election be not immediately, let's say, are less and less. His own party is already getting tired, in a way, of being in opposition, believing they can be in government. You have two strong candidates who've already put their hat in the ring. One is the ex-mayor of Jerusalem, and the other is Yuli Edelstein, the ex-speaker of the Knesset. They are both challenging Netanyahu in many ways without formally challenging him at this point in time. Everybody, as I said, knows that if Likud was in with a different leader, it would be the governing party. After all, it's got still, twice as many seats as anybody else, or almost. There are parties like Gidon Saar's party, which is a breakaway from the Likud. Lieberman could join them. I mean, they wouldn't have trouble forming a large coalition. But it's at the moment, Netanyahu still controls the party. There's no doubt about that. And also, nobody wants to be the first person to be the one to try and push him out, because they probably won't be the ones who succeed him. But I think that the longer the time goes on and this government stays in power, the less likely it starts to look like it becomes that Netanyahu will lead the Likud at the next elections.
Great. Well, Ron, we are nearly out of time. Wanted to, on behalf of the Zionist Council, the board, and the entire community, thank you for such a broad overview of some of the political context in Israel, which is not only the various parties, how they interrelate, how the 8 of them are holding together, but even providing us with a broader context into Middle East and, whether it's Iran, Turkey, etc. So we are truly grateful for your insights and your knowledge. Probably on behalf of the rest of the community, we'd like to thank you for your decades of contribution to Zionism, to advocacy for the state of Israel, for standing up for what we believe in. So on behalf of all of us, it's a bit hard to clap in Zoom, but we are extraordinarily grateful. So thank you. If I could just take 2 more minutes from everyone's time. There's probably a couple of things that are worthwhile mentioning. We've got it on the chat box. So as of this month, we've started a new newsletter called Tarbut. Tarbut means culture, where we try and introduce certain elements of Israeli culture to us over in Australia. So anything from music to listen to, food, travel ideas, etc. Certainly worthwhile. And if you're not on the mailing list, we encourage you to become one. If you are on the mailing list, feel free to read it. The other one is our next event, which is on the 25th of August. We have Ami Hurwitz, who is joining us live from New York. Anyone who is not really aware of who Ami is, he's a documentary writer, he's a script writer. He is one of the people in the forefront of fighting anti-Semitism, BDS, and again, strongly advocating for the state of Israel. He'll be talking about the new anti-Semitism and what we're seeing happening primarily on the left side of politics, where traditionally anti-Semitism has been coming much more from the far right. So probably the only other thing to say is don't forget, we've got our census later this week. So don't forget to tick Jewish. Otherwise, stay safe, be well, and Shavua Tov to everyone. All the best.